Welcome back, guys, to the Beyond Condition podcast, the voice of bodybuilding. And today's voice is a returning guest. Austin joins us. So, first of all, thank you, Austin, for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on. It's been a little while, hasn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And I've got my Fox Gym t-shirt on. I wore this on our last one because
Lovely.
it's for sure me. I'm very much, what it's like with social media. It's like, are you meeting the real person, right? That you sort
Oh,
of.
sure. Yeah.
Um,
Usually, well, a lot of times you're probably not.
Yeah. And it's for me as well, right? And I'm sure you're the same. If you're investing in people, even by following them and watching what they put out, etc., if it's a real person and you meet them like I met you, it's like, wow, that really does validate what you're putting out, if you know what I mean.
Or it doesn't validate it, depending on who it is. At least in thankfully in my case, it did validate it.
For sure, for sure. Now we're kicking off a new series today, so myth busting, and straight away I was like, I want Austin on for the first episode of 2025, and also, the topic we're going to talk about, gaining muscle. Who doesn't want to know about how to gain quality muscle tissue? So it's like, it's a really good topic because when we talk about myths within the bodybuilding space, I'm sure you'd agree, there's plenty that we fill our ears with and we
Sure.
watch. And it's very hard as well to sometimes find your way as a bodybuilder when you've got all of this stuff on social media, right?
Yeah, I think now more than ever we are just inundated with so much information, and it's really, and a lot of it's, here's what I'll say about information. I think a lot of it's probably good. I think where it gets difficult is that most things that are put out don't include context, right? So it's not that something's right or wrong or bad or good. I mean, some of the stuff is just very bad, or, but a lot of the time, it's just, you can't just read something and automatically, just because it's correct, it think that it applies to you, because there's just, or maybe it applies to you now, but in 6 months it won't. So there's just everything, and that everything's context related, and that's why, because otherwise coaches wouldn't exist. I mean, that's what our job is application and adjusting to the ebbs and flows of somebody's life, and all these things. So um, lots of good stuff. It's just difficult to apply just reading things online.
Yeah, yeah. And when it comes to gaining muscle, certainly, I guess maybe when you start out or even when you're an experienced competitor, this first sort of thought process of a myth, as it were, is that large calorie surplus. That's what's required to gain muscle. And actually, we know, I know you know, that actually, going into a slight surplus, for some people, you only need a very slight surplus. And then you look at training, nutrition, all of the different things and what you call the sort of low hanging fruit, as it were. And you can get a really good response. But there's certainly this like undercurrent of you have to really bring that surplus up to, so high, and then you've got things off the back of that as well.
Sure. So, like anything else, there's not a lot of absolutes, but there are some things that probably are true for most people. And I mean, I totally agree. I think that we've seen that translate a lot of times where somebody gains, you know, maybe a male bodybuilder gains 60 pounds in the off season and comes down and only gained 3 pounds of stage weight or something like that. We see that. I think where I think when we're talking about gaining muscle, there's kind of a, there's not necessarily a formula, but there is a point where most people need to operate to optimize it. So what is this point? You have enough body fat that everything's functioning well, but not too much body fat that you are insulin resistant and very inflamed, and your immune system's not going crazy and all these things. So there is there is an amount of body fat that you probably do need,
Mm.
right? Some people can stay a lot leaner and some people need more, but most people aren't going to optimize, we'll say, their muscle growth in an extremely lean state. And they maybe mistake this coming out of the show. They kind of like super compensate and blow up, and they're still tight and they're still lean. But the thing is, you're not really, all you're really doing there is filling out, glycogen, triglycerides, and also probably regaining muscle that you maybe lost in previous phases. And a lot of that super compensations from being very insulin sensitive. So it's like a fluid shift that you're a very extreme. You're probably not that strong yet, right? It's really you also need to be at that point where you have enough body weight and enough body fat to have those leverages in the gym and you're strong and you're progressively moving weight. So there's kind of like I call it people's fighting weight, right? It's like there's a sweet spot where you're operating well, but not you haven't overshot it yet. You haven't got into that point yet. Because generally once you get past that point, you start to see that yes, you're still going to gain weight because the laws of thermodynamics still apply, right? If you're in a calorie surplus, you're still going to gain weight, but what you'll start seeing visually is it's probably a less favorable ratio of fat to lean body mass. It's like, oh, I gained 5 pounds, but it's not a very good looking 5 pounds compared to the previous five, right? Um, so I think that that's, and then, you know what? A lot of time people kind of have to go through a few off seasons or growth phases, kind of figure that out. Probably going to get too fat the first time, you know, and and unfortunately, a lot of it finding that spot, a lot of the mistakes are made very early on because if they've done a show and they really do a very poor job coming out of the show, it's like you've already kind of you're never going to find that spot because you already overshot it within the first 4 weeks coming out of the show. So it can be difficult, but that's what I tell people. It's like what how do you optimize muscle growth? Like what's the best, and they ask about how much weight to gain or thing. I'm like, it's not a number. It's like a look and a feeling almost.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
we'll say that.
Yeah, it is as well. When you come out of being stage lean and like you say, you have that period of time and I always say this to clients, it's like they're like, I feel good within a week, and I'm like, I'll wait for your message in 6, 8, maybe more weeks where you go, I feel good, and it's like this difference, but it does come with intuition, I believe. Like you say, we can make mistakes, and this is the pivotal part of longevity as a bodybuilder. Learn, because if you're not learning yourself, yes, we have a coach and we have someone to guide the way, but invest in your own journey as well. What works for you? What have you noticed? When you get that feeling, as it were, is that different as you go through your years as a competitor? And I think that sometimes when we do have a coach, we sort of step back from actually taking on our own knowledge to progress as bodybuilders as well. And I'm sure you see this.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. Things, and that's why I said earlier, something that worked for you before may not work later. And that's why context is so important because I mentioned gaining weight in the off season. You know what? If you're newer, if it's your first 2 to 5 years, you might be able to gain 60 pounds as a guy and translate a lot of that into muscle. But guess what? If you've been training for 15 years, the likelihood of you gaining 10 to 20 pounds of tissue in a year is pretty much, we'll say this, unless you did everything wrong, the previous 14 years, it's probably not happening, right? So you would likely in that scenario not benefit from, so it's where context becomes so important. But so it's like once you kind of understand, I think once you kind of understand because when everyone talks about muscle growth, they're thinking like training, nutrition, all these things. I said, well, you actually need to understand where your body is most optimized to take advantage of all of those things, right? So, like, once you kind of understand that and you can operate in that space, then we think of the other variables, which, of course, are recovery. So, that's a lot of things, right? Nutrition. And within nutrition, you could kind of lump in like digestion and overall function into that because those things coincide. And then, obviously, training, which I feel like if I make any statements about training, I'm going to get hate messages because training is like one of the most hotly debated topics. And then, of course, supplementation in there as well. If you're enhanced, that's like a whole topic in and of itself. But let's look at the nutrition piece first. I think that where we run into the most issues, like what I always tell people, what stops a growth phase? You get too fat. That's one possibility, right? With that would probably come you're too insulin resistant, right? So you're not partitioning nutrients well, so you're gaining a lot of body fat. So that's kind of one thing. Or you can't eat anymore because digestive issues, right? Or those, or both of those things. So if you can optimize one part, which is the digestion, and then you're probably likely going to absorb and partition nutrients better. You probably will maybe stay a little bit leaner potentially for a little bit longer. And you probably aren't going to be stopped by the fact that you're having to blend your chicken every day, right? So, you know what? I couldn't sit here in 40 minutes and tell you how to fix your digestion because that's like maybe 4 hours. But what I can say is that if I were to give a couple pieces of advice, and I've kind of talked about these in some other podcasts, the biggest mistakes that bodybuilders make, or people that are eating, trying to, this could be males or females, any division really, is what are some things that we generally do when we increase food? Nutritional diversity is the first thing that goes out. When you're full and you have to eat more rice, what's left? What goes out? The fruit and the veg, right? Kicking those out, right? Or people start resorting to things like, lumping in a lot more highly processed foods to that are more calorically dense. And you know what? I don't really have, I don't so much have an issue with that up to a point. But where things become an issue for bodybuilders from a digestion perspective is that we tend to start narrowing the amount of foods that we are able to eat, right? Because there's no room in the stomach for fruit and vegetable
And
anymore.
you get a bit turned off by it, don't you? You're sort of
Yeah,
like,
well, your palate, it's not palatable. It's not, you're not hungry. It's sort of like, I don't want, I don't want to have to eat any more than I need to. So those things kind of go out. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, maybe micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, but also those types of foods that have particular fibers and are fermentable, that's what helps feed bacteria, right? So when we look at bacteria, we have kind of like dysbiotic bacteria. So those are kind of like our bad bugs, bad pathogens. And then we have the commensal bacteria or the good bugs. The reason, if you, and then I won't go too far into it, but when you look at, I use GI maps, one of the tests I use. They label those dysbiotic bugs as opportunistic bacteria. So when you hear the word opportunistic, you know why? Because they'll eat anything. So if all you eat is beef, chicken, rice, those bugs are still getting fed. But what's not getting fed optimally? The good bugs, right? So the whole takeaway from this whole thing is that basically, if we're not continuing to include variety, and we're not continuing to include some good fermentable foods, and when I say fermented, I'm not talking like sauerkraut, I'm talking prebiotic foods that actually will feed bacteria. So fruit and vegetables mostly, then that microbial diversity narrows and narrows and narrows. Bad stuff goes up and up and up. Good stuff goes, I mean, maybe it goes up, maybe it stays the same, maybe it goes down. But the point is that the ratio comes off. So now what happens? Those bad bugs create hydrogen and methane gas, so you get full quicker, you get more bloated, your motility slows down. I mean, you certainly don't want your digestive motility to slow down if you have to eat 5,000 calories a day, do you?
it's a stress on the body physiologically.
Sure. So, you know, you can't necessarily force, I don't necessarily suggest people are like force feeding fruits and vegetables. Fruit tends to be a little bit more of a better option because it's a little sweeter. It's probably a little more palatable when you're kind of, not as hungry. It's a little more calorie dense. So maybe you can't fit a lot of blueberries in because they only have 5 grams of carbs, but maybe you can eat a banana. That's a little more carb dense, right?
Yeah.
So you can blend, you can like make smoothies with like whey isolate and fruit and add a fat to it. I mean, you can pack 1,500 calories into a smoothie easy and tastes great. So I'd love to sit and talk like how you can actually include more of that stuff, but that's kind of the concept with with digestion. So from a nutrition standpoint, diversity in the diet's still going to be important. that's the whole takeaway. The less that you include in there, probably the more likely you're going to run into issues. I'll say one other thing that's going to be very controversial. Don't overconsume protein. And here's why I'm going to say that. I'm not going to give you numbers, and I'm not going to say eat point whatever grams. No. What I'm going to say is that, especially in men, because men tend to need more food, and if you're heavier and heavier, we what do we eat protein based on grams per pound or grams per kilo or grams per lean body fat. That's how we dictate that, right? So the problem with that is that nobody really no one creates enough stomach acid to digest 400 grams of protein a day if you're someone that's resorting to eating that. Okay. So you're going to run into, and that's why so many, especially male bodybuilders, have GERD, acid, like acid reflux issues, H. pylori in the stomach, ulcers, like all this upper GI issues. And I can't even tell you how many times that I've had, bigger guys come in to either work with me or just do a consult. And like, hey, here's like some inflammatory stuff we can do, immune system, and I'm just going to drop your protein, and not a lot. If they're a 300-pound IFBB pro and they're eating 400 grams of protein, maybe we drop it to 300 or 275. They're like 275. It's like just relax, right? All of a sudden, guess what happens? They start getting fuller because their nutrient partitioning and their nutrient absorption is going up. They don't require as much stomach acid because they're not pounding, they actually can create enough acid from the parietal cells to digest that 275. So everything's working better. Plus, we're just going to fill those calories in with carbs and fat, and all that stuff's protein sparing anyhow. And they're taking enough gear that muscle protein breakdown's not that high. So, like, you're okay. Trust me. Um, and all of a sudden they just like get better pumps, and they're getting hungrier quicker between meals, and they're like pounding down food, and they're getting strong, and they feel better. And I'm like, yeah, because you're not trying to digest half of a cow every day. I know that's like, I know some people like that's very controversial statement, but
Yeah,
I'll
but
say
this
it anyhow.
is the point in this series, and also you raise a valid point with gear. I feel like there's going to be people that are, maybe having a lot of protein or a lot of the calorie surplus, what we've spoken about, and then they get the GI distress, and then the gear goes up. And it's this, almost like, where do we go here? Where do we go here? We're pounding a load of gear, pounding a load of food, maybe the inactivities there as well. And it's going to be very hard for your physique to continue responding to quality muscle tissue gain.
Right. Yeah. It's because they're like, I can't eat anymore. My weight's not going up anymore. So naturally, let's up the dose. Right. and and then you generally, depending on the compounds, some are a little rougher on digestion than others. I mean, hopefully they're not pounding down a bunch of oral methylated you know androgens in the off season, but even some of the injectable compounds are a little rougher on that. And even digestion aside, it's just a lot of like oxidative stress on the body over time. And here's the thing, is like, we pretty much know that more is better, but more is better until it's not anymore. Everything, but that's the thing with everything we do, is it's all, pretty much everything is dose response. Like, we know more training volume creates, up to a point, we pretty much, all the research shows that more training volume creates more, stimulus. But then why are people progressing on low volume? And then why? But what happens if you do too much training volume,
Mm.
right? Well, you can't recover. So there's always everything's kind of that, in, that like, right, where it's like more, more, more. Uh-oh, too much. Now the effect is down and down and down. So training, food, androgens, you know, everything, right? And that's why it's like body weight, blood glucose, like the very first thing I talked about in the beginning was the sweet spot. So everything's a sweet spot. There's a point. there's that point where everything is working well, and bodybuilder and a lot of people will feel that. And then when it stops, I think what happens is when it stops or slows down, that's when they get a little bit discouraged. So they add maybe too much food, or they start. I think that people are making like kind of emotional decisions because they're like, oh, it's not moving as quick as it did. And so they're like, I gotta bump the dose. I gotta bump the dose. I gotta bump the dose. I gotta increase the food. I gotta go get, a burger and fries twice a week because I'm not fast, whatever. The next thing you know, their digestion goes to shit. And and then what happens when things start going wrong? You start making even worse irrational decisions and start adding even more shit on top of it,
Yeah. It's
you
that,
know.
the risk reward ratio. I feel like many body, including myself, I have a very addictive personality. So, you put a compound in, goes well. What's next? Okay, so this is a gateway to another compound. Maybe I up the dose next time. Maybe I run it for longer, depending on if you're doing exposures or you're just, using anabolics for long periods of time. And your risk reward changes. And sometimes you don't even really realize. And then you're at this point with like, where do I now go? If you know what I mean.
Well, and that brings up a great a great thought, is that if something's working, don't get greedy and just let it work. Because yeah, you know perhaps something else or a slight change could maybe produce a very slight improvement, but you're looking for a 1% reward with a 99% downside. So like, for example, peak week's a great example. If you do something really really crazy, you you could get that extra 2%, but there's a 98% chance that you're actually going to make it worse, right?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like that in the off season, and with gaining muscle is more, it's like, if it's working, because someone thinks if this much works this good, then this much must work better. So that's food, gear, training, blah 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 blah. And you really forget that, because we can kind of talk about this next. You really forget that the whole other equation is, for every output that could, or I guess inputs to the food and gear are inputs. Training, I guess, would be like in I don't know how you would want to consider it, but basically there has to be, for every kind of stressor, there has to be a recovery equal to that, right? So every stress that you put on your body, so like androgens, for example, I mean, it is a stress. It's a pro and a con, right? Because it's doing something good, but it's also doing something bad. So you also have to have there's a stressor. Training is a stressor. Your work, your relationships, your sleep, if you're not getting enough, stressor. Um, your mentality, your emotional state. That's the other thing, is all of us in this space are a little crazy. So chances are, it's like you check the boxes, you sleep, you do all those things, but you're an anxious mess all day. So you know what that is? That's like sympathetic drive, sympathetic drive, sympathetic drive. They're like, well, I'm sleeping, you know, 7 or 8 hours a day. I'm like, yeah, but you are like this all the time. I said, I don't care if you're sleeping 12 hours a day. It's not gonna make a difference. But my point in saying that is, it's people use they use like the bucket example. You can't overfill your bucket. Or I like to use, but where I like to think about it is a pie chart. Remember pie charts? How they have like the percentages on there? So you have good and bad stressors that you can input on there. So like sleep, if sleep is really good, the way the pie chart would look is it would take up very little of the pie chart because it's not stressing you. It's actually helping your stress. So it's clearing. So what is it doing? It's making more space on the pie, right? But if sleep is really bad, then it's going to make less space on the pie because it is a stressor.
Like that.
If your training is just right and you're not training so much that you're cutting into your recovery capacity, oops, smaller piece on the pie. If you're doing 7 days a week, ridiculous volume, whoop, big piece on the pie, right? So that's kind of but you still only have 100% at the end of the day. So you can overfill. Our bodies are very, very good at being resilient to stress acutely, short term. It's just that most of the time when we're starting to run into issues with people where they're not gaining muscle, or they're not being productive with their goals, they're not dropping body fat, it's because it's chronic, it's a chronic thing. So within your off season and when you're looking at recovery, if you're training and you're not at least occasionally progressing on movements, or you're not you're maybe even backsliding, or you're not, when I say progressing on movements, you're not like you're not always going to progress on weight, because if you've been training for 20 years, maybe that's not going to happen. But if you're at the peak of the off season, you should feel very controlled with the weight, like better contractions. Maybe progression could also be just a slightly slower rep that's a little more controlled. You're kind of owning that weight. If you hear people talk about that, like, I'm owning that weight, because that's still maybe a progression of sorts, right? But if there's nothing positive happening, and you're not feeling strong in the gym, and you're tired and blah blah, whatever, I would argue that you're probably not recovering well, right? I would say that you're doing too much of something, or you're not doing enough of something. And I don't know what it is, because I'm just some dude sitting here talking on a podcast, and I don't know who's listening, but it's, I think that people they probably overestimate how much they can do. That's probably actually a more accurate statement, is because what's happening with people that are very type A like us, that are very driven, is they are going to do it no matter what. And generally, with if we rated, their stress on a scale of 1 to 10, they're so accustomed to whatever they feel that it's probably a 9, but they're going to say it's a 1 because it's just what they're used to, and they never felt anything different.
Yeah, I also think as well that it's quite uncomfortable at times to actually go within a little bit and be like, am I, stressed all the time? Am I suffering a lot with things like anxiety? And actually get to and it's not really a root cause, as it were, because this could be something that spans over years, but what are causing these things? And can you actually take power to do something about it to actually facilitate a better physique response? Because certainly this is something I know you do, and I do personally as a coach. It's actually working with individuals to understand, if these things, if they're triggered, if there's certain things going on, could we actually work on those and do the bodybuilding still? We don't have to stop that, but can we work on things over time? And honestly, and I'm sure you're going to have many, many case studies where you're like, shit, this bodybuilder has gone from bodybuilding to bodybuilding. And it's
Mm.
wild the effect that that work inside can have.
You made me think of something that, so over the holidays, I noticed something. There's things I pay attention to that are probably a little different than what, and maybe not. It may be some other coaches, you will probably understand what I'm saying, are paying attention to this stuff. But what I kind of always say about improving as a competitor, improving as a bodybuilder, is at the beginning, you're learning how to check the boxes. You're learning how to train properly. You're learning how to prep your food. I don't know, whatever, like, the stuff that we have to learn. But once you know how to do that, it shouldn't take, it really shouldn't take much brain power to process those thoughts, because much of it's very automatic. And I always say it's kind of like software in your brain, right? And I would say it's even easier for the fact that most people have coaches that are already doing that for them. They're already, right? The coach is already doing all that mental work for you. So all you have to do is just do it. I mean, if you know how to eat, and you know how to train, and you know how to do what is on the plan, there's like, what is there to think about, right? Nothing really. So other than how you fit it into your schedule, maybe, that kind of thing, how you prioritize that in your day. So you know how to do all that stuff. How do you actually still continue to improve as an athlete? And part of it could be, maybe you're a little better at being more concise with your feedback to your coach. Maybe that's something, right? You're looking at the right variables. because like when people check in and they don't know how to check in, one of two things happens. They give too little or they give way too much. Or they give a bunch of stuff that's not relevant and very little that's actually helpful. Right? It's like, here's what I did all weekend. I walked my dog, and we went to the movies and stuff. It's like, that's cool, but what about the stuff that I need? Or they're very hyper focused on stuff that's not important, which is stress. They're driving stress, 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 stress. So my point there is like those are things that you can get better at as an athlete. But I mentioned the holidays because I had a client today. And I don't know if he'll listen to this, but he's been with me for years, years, and he's improved a ton over time. But um, bodybuilder and classic physique guy. But anyhow, he pointed out that he didn't feel like he wanted to overeat it or binge in at Christmas this year. And because he's like, my mom, I think it said it was his mom or his grandmother, I can't remember. They have tons of sweets, tons of junk food, tons of all that stuff. He's like, his weight fluctuated like 2 pounds and it went back down immediately. And 2 pounds for a bigger person's nothing. It's nothing, right? And I said, you know what that is? It's that you've continued to mature as an athlete. And something that him and I have been working on is he has a great career and he's kind of moved in different positions and he has some business events and stuff. And I'm like, dude, it's okay. It's like I can help you figure out how to manage this stuff and eat and enjoy it and but still stay on track. So we've done all that work, which means that he was able to navigate the holiday by himself. I didn't have to do anything, but that was a maturity thing as an athlete because historically, when people when people are too rigid and they don't know how to be flexible or adapt to situations, it's going to be black and white. So it's going to be like, I have to just eat everything that's here. And it's an unconscious thing because you have been you lack any type of flexibility and you're also like so hyper focused on things that you don't know how to be in normal situations when you get presented with them. And I used to be that way, trust me. I just have to get through my week to have my free meal,
I've been there.
but the free meal is going to be a free meal. And you know what, I'll tell you what, it sucks because it's a terrible feeling because when you go into the free meal, you're not in control.
Yeah.
You're not in control. The only thing that stops you is you go to the point where you felt miserable and you eventually will stop because you just felt so shitty. And that's an eating disorder for any of you that don't know that. Hello. Um, that is, I mean, it's disordered eating. It's maybe not you're not binging all the time, but it's a form of it, right? So I think that where so many people kind of make this stuff harder on themselves is they do have a coach and they do have someone that can you know, take a lot of that mental burden off them, whether it's an off season or prep. But I really think, man, in the off season and when you're trying to gain muscle, if you can just be pretty good at providing just the right feedback and checking those boxes and following your plan, you should pretty much be able to just enjoy your life and just be a person. I mean, I do more different stuff in my life now than I ever have. And made the most progress I've ever made was in the last 2 years, and I've been bodybuilding for 17 years, being less rigid.
Yeah, because you learn how to enjoy life, and again, I think that's something that is difficult. I mean, we've both been there. We've just spoken about that, and I've certainly been there. And
Yeah,
actually, I literally spoke about this on my Instagram the other day. Bodybuilding as a principle is extremely simple, right? What we need to do, and as you say, over
for
time,
sure.
you don't even have to think about it. You just do it. But then it's like, okay, so what do I enjoy? What do I want to do outside of bodybuilding? But that has a direct impact on not only enjoyment from the pursuit, but maybe it helps you also manage your stress as well, because actually
Sure.
you're doing other things. But I feel like, certainly there is this, I'm a bodybuilder. I can't do anything else. And again, it's almost like a myth, isn't it? And we see it on social media. I have no days off. I do this, I do that. And it's like sometimes people are going to read into that athletes don't have off plan, they don't do any other things, but maybe actually the off plan is in the plan. So yes, they're ticking the boxes, but they're still doing those things. You know what I mean?
Crazy concept. I know. It's the if I'm gonna, it's funny because I'm gonna eat all these meals and do the training, but if I lock myself inside my house while I do it, it's gonna work better. I'm like, okay, why? And I know we got off track a little bit there, but I think it really, like you said, as a principle, it's so simple. There's a lot of aspects of it that are difficult. Like if you're in the scenario in the off season where your digestion starts to get a little funky, first response is, oh no, something's wrong. And that's true. So you have a couple options. You can stop and think about, okay, what variable changed, or maybe what has accumulated to get me to this point. Or you can hire Sarah, or you can hire me, or you can do a consultation with someone or something. But my point is that the answer, the answer is probably never to add more stress to whatever the situation is. Like if your digestions already suck, adding another 500 milligrams to your dose is probably not the thing that's going to get you more muscle,
Yeah, and
right? So,
you know, feedback as well to the coach, isn't it? Like, are you telling your coach, like, I'm really,
yeah,
because the coach is saying up the gear or whatever, and it's like, actually, is your intuition, do you need to actually be a bit more transparent and honest with how you're feeling rather than this? And this is where I feel like the best coaching comes is like you say, you give good feedback in your check-ins, the coach guides the ship, but you do the do, and it really complements it as well.
sure. And you have to, and yeah, and you have to provide the feedback. I can't pull it out of thin air, right? And I don't always know what's going on. I can't tell you how many situations in an off season, digestion being a great example, where they all of a sudden they tell me something. I'm like, do you realize there was about 10 other things that had to happen before you got that bad? What happened? I said, I ask you about this stuff every week.
It's like, oh, I didn't want to bother you, and it's like, actually, it's very relevant, and I think that sometimes, we do need to be a bit more transparent and open. Like you say, it's like, how's your stress? Fine, but it could be actually a 10, but you're like, no, no, I'm fine.
Well, and the other thing, and you say you don't want to bother me. I said, what's really bothersome is now I have this giant pile of shit that I have to fix, and I could have just stopped it right from the beginning and fixed it with very little effort from the start. And now, but we're all kind of guilty of that. We're all guilty of not addressing something until it becomes really bad, right? We've all done that. And maybe it's not bodybuilding, but maybe it's something else in life, but human nature is kind of that, unfortunately. But when you're already paying someone, you should just kind of feel comfortable and feel at ease in the fact that they are going to be able to help you. So we kind of talked about the nutrition a little bit and the recovery a little bit. I mean, with the training aspect is just there's so much there. I know, like I said earlier, I hate all the training zealots are gonna jump out and send me mean DMs. The the only problem I have with a lot of that stuff is that it's like someone says, if someone wants to talk about what training is good and what's bad, that in and of itself is a flawed message, because all you have to do is look around and see the fact that there's so many people that have progressed on drastically different types of training for years. We had pumping iron back in the day where they trained twice a day and super high volume. We have Dorian Yates, we have whatever. We've got currently, I mean, you look at drastically different sides of the camp. You have like the Jordan Peters side, who's low volume. He does kind of and I don't know Jordan well. I assume he does kind of like a higher frequency approach where he'll train like multiple things on one day, or train compound movements that train like multiple muscle groups and whatever. Then you got one camp over here who's doing 40 working sets in a session because the research. Now, on one hand, you could say, well, Jordan's bigger than them, so he must be right. Okay, first off, if you do what he does, you're still not going to be that big, probably. Because I have clients that are bigger than me, and if I do the same thing that I tell them to do, it doesn't work the same.
I love
Because
it.
they're just better than me. So it is what it is. But on the one hand, you could say, well, so and so over here's smaller than them, so they're wrong. Like I don't know that that's necessarily true either way. I think that when you look at training, when you look at the variables, intensity, volume, load, I guess, like progression and load. I mean, kind of, we basically know that you probably need to progress something to get better, right? So when you're kind of figuring out what that is, we know that in beginners and even maybe intermediates, the amount that like the minimum effective dose is probably pretty low compared to an advanced person, right? Just about everything helps if
Mm.
they can do it progressively and consistently. And so probably doing whatever they can recover from and enjoy is going to be effective. When you get advanced, okay, we have to have a little different conversations because and when I say advanced, it doesn't mean huge. It just means that you probably have been training a really long time and you're probably pretty far away from your natural baseline. So if you were naturally 200 pounds in high school, then being 300 pounds might be realistic. But if you were only 100 pounds in high school, being 200 pounds is probably pretty far away from your baseline, So that's how I would consider someone advanced is they have kind of gotten really close to that genetic ceiling,
Mm.
right? So then you do need to be more considerate of you're probably going to have to prioritize. I can do this much training volume, but I have to allocate more towards muscle groups that need to be prioritized, and they need maybe maintenance volume for things that don't need to be prioritized as much. That's kind of like a general concept for specialization or prioritization type training, right? Your movement selection might need to get a little bit more strategic because you kind of have to think that you're handling a lot higher loads, at least relevant to your own capacity. If It's the same reason that I don't really barbell squat and do a lot of certain compound movements anymore because if I have to do 5 or 6 plates aside, it's a shitload of warm ups. It's a lot of stabilization to even do it and get it into place. And it's a lot of bracing and wasted, like a lot of like energy that I'm kind of wasting just to perform the warm ups and the movement versus kind of like locking myself into a braced pattern where I can drive directly to the areas I want to drive it to. And you've seen that over time, right? Like if you look at some of these really big guys, do you notice how some of them were kind of on machines later as they got humongous?
Yeah.
There might be a reason for that, perhaps. It's not to say that free weights are wrong or compound movements are bad. That is not at all true. But biomechanically, certain things might not suit you, especially as you get bigger and stronger. That's fine. I still do some free weight movements,
Mm.
but there's others that I don't do anymore
Yeah, I'm exactly.
because of that.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
it's that taxation, isn't it? And it's what is the recoverable volume? I mean, we could do a whole podcast on recoverable volume. I also have some listener questions from Jack, who was actually a guest on last week's
sure.
and one of them sort of relates to training, as it were. Now, an extension of what I was going to ask anyway with regards to cardio in off season, but he also asked, can you do a prep and get lean without cardio? So we wanted to ask that question first. It,
Hmm. Well, first off, if a lot of people don't count steps as cardio, which is this kind of probably a flawed definition, right? Because if you just doing 15,000 steps is still a lot of expenditure. So I would want to know if are you literally saying can you get lean by sitting at a desk all day and not moving at all and just manipulating nutrition? Someone can, not most people, right? Because you probably can't you're probably going to have a hard time creating enough of a deficit to do it. And it would also depend on the largest thing would probably depend on how much adaptation your body tends to have
Mhm.
with calories. If you're a male that eats a lot in the off season, you don't adapt much as you come down. If you're eating 6,000 calories and you normally have to eat 4,000 calories or 3,500 calories and do cardio 5 days a week, you could probably just eat 2,500 calories instead and do no cardio.
Yeah,
But if you're a female that has to do cardio and eat 1,000 calories, there is not enough window there to make that equation work, right? Um, so maybe
yeah.
I'll say that if you could, that might be beneficial to certain people. I think certain people, if they have a really high stress load already and they train very hard, there's probably a point where maybe less cardio and also less food could be helpful because it's just less stressful.
Mm.
But man, I wish I could just get lean with no cardio.
I know, I love it. I know you did season where you did like hardly any steps and stuff. I remember you talking about on OPD. Do you do cardio in the off season now?
So I have a step count that I'll hit. So it takes me so if I take my regular movement around, around the house or outside, I'm adding about an additional it probably takes me an additional 30 to 45 minutes of walking to finish the steps. But for me, that might only be, 8 or 9,000 or 10,000 steps because this is no steps here. This is where I'm at most of the time. That's also why I think that when people throw out, they start with their clients and they throw out some 10,000 steps. I'm like, based on what? Because if they walk around all day, 10,000 might not be anything. But if they sit all day, 10,000, they might have to get on the damn treadmill for an hour and a half to
Yeah.
do 10,000. But I do think that I like to keep a little bit in. I do think from a digestive standpoint, maybe insulin sensitivity standpoint, some movement helps. I just think it feels I can say from someone who has sat in this chair for about 14 hours without moving other than to go pee, you just don't feel great
For sure.
doing it. Moving around helps.
For sure, for sure. Now, he also asked, from a PD aspect, is growth the last compound to use? So, would you have clients that you put growth in, early days from PD use, or is it something that you would sort of work toward?
Um, I think it's probably kind of a second, I'm going to call it a second to third. Man, I don't know if I like that. I'm going to call it a second to third tier. And the reason for that is because I don't want to say second to third cycle because you might be able to do the same first cycle 3 or 4 times and it still work really well before you need to add additional stimulus to it. But when I say second or third tier, when you've done whatever your first option is, maybe it's a testosterone or like a testosterone and a DHT or something, or for females, maybe it's like a little bit of primobolan or something. I don't know. And your second tier would mean that kind of stopped working or you need more. Second tier would mean do we add another compound or more of the compound, or do we add a different pathway by which we can benefit from? Because that GH would be a different pathway,
Mhm.
right? And the whole that's that's been the whole push in the past probably 5 years, right? Is the safer use model. Like how do we utilize multiple pathways or multiple mechanisms to gain tissue? On one hand, some people say, well, you should save that tool for a lot later. I never had to use whatever to get to a certain point until I was a pro or whatever. So, well, guess what? Some people are never going to turn pros. That's a stupid argument. It's like that's a shitty argument for one. But yeah, probably second or third tier. I think for females as well, just because the whole concern a lot of the time is virilization, and you don't you're not likely going to have much issue with that. So instead of just increasing your primobolan or whatever, why not add a different pathway or increasing your testosterone dose? Um, so yeah, second or third tier. I don't really think it's something that's has to be held out for years. And dose of that compound could go up over time too. Like that could be another tier. Maybe you're starting at, if you're a guy, maybe you're starting at like 2 to 4 units. Maybe later, if you're really pushing the envelope and you're getting up into those high ranks, you're doing eight or 10, or some people do more.
Yeah, I know. I've heard
I
some
don't know how
rock.
much money you have.
This is the thing, isn't it? Yeah, it's on the higher end of the spectrum of.
Right.
And the last question he asked, which will wrap us up nicely, because there is going to be a lot of females listening, and I get questions being in the bikini division myself. Do you believe on, or I don't know if you've worked with people, that you can turn pro as a natural for bikini realms?
Um, Personally, no, but it definitely happens. I think that I think that if it's probably the most likely division, if it's going to happen, that's probably the division that it's going to happen in, right? Just because it's the least amount of overall muscle tissue, but getting big, boxed out, shelf like glutes is not easy.
No.
The thing about that is, in order to answer that question, what you would kind of have to look at is what does that person look like before they ever touched a weight, or like what does their kind of baseline look like, or what does their first year of lifting look like with just basic nutrition and basic training? Like, how good are they? And you could probably answer that question because there's plenty of people that do everything right that that have to use some PDs and they still don't turn pro. So it's very much, and it kind of goes back to what I said earlier of like one of my guys that is a big open pro bodybuilder. He's when we started 5 years ago or 4 years ago, had done one show, I think, at that point. He did I believe he did one show, and then USA's was like his first, and he got third as a super heavyweight. It was his first national show, which was only like his third show ever, or second show. And then he turned pro in his next national show. And then he placed in his first season of competition. But my point in that is he was already like 290 pounds. Now, granted, it was not a great 290 pounds, but I couldn't even weigh 290 pounds at all. Like I would literally have to be bedridden and then like IV sure shoving feeding tube down my throat to be 290 pounds. I don't even, you know what I mean?
Yeah, for
So the
sure.
fact that you get some of these pros and like, man, they're so huge. How do I get that huge? I'm like, they were 220 in high school.
Sure, for sure.
I said, you were 120 in high school. I said they were bench pressing football, they're playing American, right? American football. They were in the weight room bench pressing 315 and when they were 18 years old for reps. I'm like, dude, there's just levels to this. And that goes for bikini. So yeah, I'm sure there are plenty of girls out there that could do it. And if you can, that's great.
Mm,
Do it.
yeah, for
I
sure.
would if I could.
Yeah, yeah. Take the stress out and the cost.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
I love that.
But
Well, thank you, Austin.
cool.
As always, I
Yeah.
our talks and good to speak with you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Anytime you want to chat, I'm always more than happy to come on.
Thank you, Austin. I'll speak to you soon.
Yep. Have a good one. Bye bye.
Bye.